To look at every work of art ever created, particularly with the time restriction of 6 hours, is impossible. All study of historical material involves selection. With prehistorical material, that's less of an issue, as you just select everything you're lucky enough to find. But otherwise, our historians have to decide what to study. However, and this is what I call Gombrich's paradox, as it's a paraphrasing of an issue raised by Ernst Gombrich. To select the material for study, you have to have a criterion for selection. You have to have a theory of what the history of art is. But that theory has to be based on something, and it has to be based on the study of art historical objects. But which ones? So there's the paradox. It's a little bit like a chicken and an egg. So I need to decide what I'm going to study, but in order to decide what to study, I need some kind of idea of the thing that I'm studying. But in order to do that, I need to study it. So, which ones? My aim is to use a variety of frames: aesthetic, economic, philosophical, physical, political, psychological, religious and social, to approach the works of art. I've selected items which, although they can be argued to be representative of their era, more importantly, we can use them to gain special insights into the thinking and organisation of the people and societies concerned. But there's a problem. The selection incorporates issues of mental well-being, expanded notions of sexuality, will encounter political radicalism, but firstly, it's a list of artists, and they're almost all European, which for large parts of history is synonymous with being white and turning up in big boats with guns in countries where people aren't white. And secondly, this list of artists, they're almost all men, in large parts of history in which men have orchestrated societies patriarchally to ensure their positions of power. It's still a relevant topic today. To a certain extent, you can argue that this canon or traditional selection is a reflection of the societies producing the art. But we don't have to like it. So, wherever I can, I'll be trying to overturn this traditional selection and look at artists who are overlooked, underprivileged. And the fact that you don't have to look too far tells you that the traditional selection is a selection based on traditions of thinking. But we're here to think again. One of the things that art can do is to defamiliarize, to allow us to see an object devoid of accumulated preconceptions, afresh, anew. This is just a bit of fun. I'm not expecting you to know the answers to these questions on the board, nor am I expecting you not to, necessarily. So could I put you in pairs, group of 3, for 2 minutes only, to discuss possible answers to these questions? Okay, thank you. So what ideas did that produce? So, first question, what is it? Well, it's known as the Makapanskat pebble. That's the Makapanskat pebble. It's made of jasperite, which was made by geological processes between 4 billion and half a billion years ago, and by water erosion thereafter, which gave the stone its appearance. And owing to a psychological process known as pareidolia, it looks like a human face. Pareidolia is what enables humans to recognize and extract features of the human face. But what does all this mean? Well, the fact that the pebble was found in a cave high up in the Makapanskat Valley, surrounded by the remains of Australopithecine hominids from around 2 million years ago, probably meant two things. It means that the SRGAP2 gene, which was present in Australopithecines and which increases cerebral mass and synaptic efficiency, enabled the hominid to recognize the pebble as looking like a face. And if we expand the definition of art to include objet, trouve, or objects which are found but not made, this represents the first recorded work of art in human history. And it's a good place to make a beginning in terms of human history and the period of the rest of this session. There's also some terminology here on this table for chronology that will be useful for the rest of this session. The 3 Stone Age eras: Paleolithic, Mesolithic and Neolithic. So paleo just means early. We'll see that when we look at early Christian art made in Rome. It's called Paleo-Christian art. Mesolithic, middle. We look at the art of Central America, Middle America, Mesoamerican art. Neolithic, so the latest new Stone Age. We'll also look at the ancient historical eras of Bronze Age and Iron Age, named for the 2 metallurgical technologies that defined and enabled the ages to define themselves. Briefly, a little bit of technology. In order to understand what we're looking at, we need to know about relative dates of the objects in order to see a progression. How do we actually know about the dates of objects? Different techniques are to look at calcite formations in caves. Calcite is just calcium carbonate, CaCO3. It's what makes water hard. It's scale in your kettle. And it drips through caves and then forms over surfaces, including painted surfaces. Another thing to look at is relative depths of soil layers in which you find objects. More reliably, radiocarbon dating, and briefly, as I can't claim this to be an area of my specialism, essentially radiation, mostly from the sun, cosmic radiation, damages nitrogen molecules, the main component of our atmosphere. That creates unstable and radioactive carbon molecules, which are absorbed into plants along with normal carbon molecules as carbon dioxide. And the plants then create sugars using carbon, C6H12O6, and this then ends up in animals, for example. Then as soon as the organism, plant, animal dies, it starts to decrease, it starts to decay radioactively. So the percentage of radioactive carbon decreases so steadily over time that we can tell the age of the object by the ratio of radioactive carbon molecules that are left to the normal ones which are permanent, with quite a small margin of error. So that's how we know when organic compounds 50,000 years ago, for example, were formed. As I said, in prehistory, the criterion for selection is just the practical matter of what's been found. And works of art from before the Holocene are mostly confined to cave wall painting and adaptive carving of stone antler or wood. But nevertheless, to interpret the art you need a theory. And it's interesting to see how those theories change over time according to the ideas of the societies that created them. That's why we need to be aware and be aware of the art that we're selecting, because it's dictated by a criterion that comes from a theory that's very much of its time. Here we have the 20th century history of art, historical theories about Paleolithic, Mesolithic and Neolithic cave art. So under Darwinian influence, historians were keen to emphasize the progress made by modern man. But with the Freudian and Jungian revolutions, the primitive became a way of reflecting on modern man. Then following Saussure, structuralism meant an analysis of meaning within an organized network of ideas. This led to post-structuralism and more complex ideas of the interconnectedness of meaning as a kind of language. And in the more post-colonial era, a recognition of the social structures and belief systems still present in some indigenous, non-European societies today. So looking at this work, the Venus of Willendorf, one of the oldest Paleolithic works we have found, we can interpret the work in different ways, as an object of deep contemplation and of religious worship, and as an expression of primeval needs, of the socio-economic need for fertility of the tribe and of the land, a deliberate artistic style and an intensely tactile object expressing these ideas, and simply as an expression of female beauty. To us it can represent evidence of the kinship we have with people living tens of thousands of years ago. Although the title, the Venus of Willendorf, given at the beginning of the 20th century was intended to be ironic, it can now actually be reclaimed. It is the goddess of love. It's an adoration, or a need, something like love. Someone lost, someone wanted, someone found and remembered, something that can represent all of these. We don't know. Projecting the assumption that the artists were men, it's been speculated that they are self-portraits of women. There's a debate on the idea that hominids would have been able to see themselves in puddles. There's no need to exclude the idea of self-portraits painted from memory. But in addition to all these theories that have changed over the last 100 years on how we should approach Neolithic art, we've overlooked one by E.H. Gombrich, and it offers us a way in, offers us a way of seeing the link between the art and the context by asking us to consider how the items were used. Now, in the case of this carved bone, which records the phases of the moon over the period of a month, it shows an engagement with astronomical phenomena. It shows an engagement with recording time and trying to understand time. And this is going to be so crucial later on in the agricultural revolution that we'll come to later. With these antler headdresses, the holes are for straps for it to be worn on top of the head. It's one of several of these found in northern England. We can speculate that it wasn't worn to keep the wearer warm or dry. Probably had a function of status or tribal belonging, or a ceremonial or a ritual function. Or perhaps it was recreational, a kind of deer party hat. But how were cave paintings used? Not knowing means we really approach these objects as functional images, as works of art. And that's really how the filmmaker Werner Herzog has approached this in his film Cave of Forgotten Dreams, which is to be recommended for its access that it gained during the making of the film to Chauvet caves, and the evocative commentary. It's a full-length film, but unfortunately we don't have time for an excerpt, so that could be something to watch at home. The Chauvet cave is a fairly recent discovery, in very good condition, and the works there are of incredible artistic quality in terms of the close observation and naturalistic representation. Now, naturalism is a key artistic term, meaning a representation done from close observation of and copying of the visual appearance of things, often of nature. It's different from realism, which is a decision about what you choose to represent, and that decision is often a political one. For example, the decision to paint the hardship of agricultural workers instead of an idealized world of mythology or idealized political rulers. These images were all presumably drawn from memory, and hence show a highly developed level of artistic awareness and skill. The period covered in the caves and the time needed for the works implies a continuity of artistic tradition. You have many different hands, different styles working on one image, and therefore a high value placed by this society on these images. In a sense, these practitioners were artists and art historians all in one. Lascaux in France is perhaps, along with Altamira in Spain, the most famous cave containing wall painting, and Lascaux has the intriguing man and bird panel, which is in a deep shaft below the part of the cave known as the apse, apse being the end of a church. The terminology is interesting, as it's a part of the cave which would never have been touched by daylight at all, in pitch blackness, although this contrast is lost now as the whole cave system is now light protected. There's a sealed door on the front. Some theorists have speculated that this may have been a place of meditation, and the strange combination of bird, man with phallus, and bird-like face with a bison may have had resonant meaning, being placed as they were next to the panel of the wounded man. Perhaps meditation here was on mortality, on the afterlife, on our place in the natural world, on the link between procreation and nature, on animism and the spirits of animals. It's a good place to pause here. I'll show you a computer-generated tour of the caves, and I'd like to encourage you to talk in pairs and just give your personal responses to these images as you see them, created by people surviving in hostile environments, uncontrolled as our modern world is. And yet here are the beginnings of real works of art. This desire for the ideas and feelings inside to be projected outside and explored and shared. This level of analysis, of reflection, of time dedicated to creation, this is what will explode over the following 10 centuries into what we call civilization. A quick word about music. There's evidence of Paleolithic interest in music. One good reason for characterizing particular periods and locations as Stone Age is that much of the perishable creations they must have made with feather, wood, reed, leaf, skin didn't survive. Paleolithic bone flutes, bear jaw flutes, vulture wing radii have been found which create the pentatonic scale. However, and cave acoustics would have provided for sustained notes and harmonies, but we can only speculate as to what other instruments existed. Skin drums, and we can only speculate as to what music was played. But over the soundtrack of the Lascaux websites, they have 21st century music. Instead of that, I'll be playing a recording of a Paleolithic bear jawbone flute. Now obviously it's played by a modern artist, but the musician is actually finding the notes which the flute creates. The cave, as I say, is now fully lit behind a closed door with artificial lighting. Paleolithic lamps, using oil for example, would have been dimmer, but the eye would have compensated for that. So you would have been in an environment which was seen. As Leonardo da Vinci experienced, going into an unknown cave can provoke anxiety, but for the Paleolithic cave dweller, it would have represented shelter, security, society. It would have been a place for, among other things, fire, light, cooking, eating, physical closeness, sleeping, dreaming, making music, and making art.